CM, everybody, welcome. I want to acknowledge this morning in this territory, this afternoon in this territory, that we're coming from southern Vancouver Island. I'm on the traditional unceded territory of this Nanaimo people. I want to welcome all our guests to our Truth and Reconciliation Commission 57, Call to Action 57 speaker series. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I'm the Director of Instruction for Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools. And I want to introduce my two co-hosts, Tsilhqot'in, Lawrence Mitchell and Stephanie Johnson, and we'll be your hosts for the next hour. I also want to raise my hands to Tsilhqot'in, who is in the traditional Coast Salish way is going to open our house and create a space for us to have this conversation. It's up.
Racha Sathmain Hajka Dihwami Amastal Quillu Quam Squalawan Dihwam Chai Amastal Quilla H Squalawan Dihwam Tlachen to Stadiketh Lala Method Sep the Sulhanst Tiwiath San Quaswa Kikalis Kaki Nastimoch Die Stlatha kan stoch dan het chwamoch. Heidschka de hai al ei squail. Heidschka cons nanut tliat nemeth. Nawash kwam comes dan a sali. A ton of quail. Eat a milk squail. Oh, 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 hey, oh, 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 hey. Oh, 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 hey, oh, 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 hey. Whoa, oh, hey, oh, oh, hey. Whoa, oh, hey, oh, oh, hey. Whoa, oh, oh, hey, oh, oh, hey. Whoa, oh, oh, hey, oh, oh, hey. Whoa, oh, hey, oh, oh, hey. Whoa, oh, hey, 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 oh, hey. Whoa, Hachka.
Tsi'Q'in. Always like to take a breath after you do that, right? To just enjoy that moment. So, and welcome everybody. Our TRC speaker series is part of our school district's efforts to learn to walk differently and walk better on the territories that we serve. In this case, the Nawash, the Snuneymuxw, and the Tsi'Q'in First Nations. We host 15,000 students across our school district. About 2,500 of them identify as being of Indigenous ancestry, and many of them from families who have been here since the beginning of time. So we know that there's knowledge in this territory that we need to recognize as we carry on this path. And we've been assisted greatly by UBC Press and Carrie Kilmartin in identifying some knowledge keepers from across this territory, from across Turtle Island itself. And they've joined us to share their knowledge with us in our efforts to learn how to walk this path well. One of those today is Lindsay Keegitah Borrows. Her book, Otter's Journey, is an amazing story of travels across this globe in recognizing nations' efforts to bring law and language and land all together to keep that knowledge in the present. She's Anishinaabe. She's from the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation in Ontario. She runs land-based legal education groups in her home territory. She's a legal researcher, and she, like her character, Otter, is quite curious about the world. And she is going to share some of that curiosity and learnings with us today. So welcome, Lindsay, and thanks for being with us today.
I really appreciate the introduction, the words shared, the song shared. And I'm really grateful that we began with song, because what I'll be speaking about today, Indigenous language and laws, one of the ways we give breath and body to language and laws through our songs. And I love how it invites in the presence of those loving beings who we might not see, different spirits, our ancestors, our future descendants. And it's beautiful to feel connected to the incredible loving universe that we're a part of, even though it can be very challenging at times. And grateful to UBC Press, to Stephanie, to Ted as well for the organizing work. And I just wanted to say that I have a special connection to the Nanaimo Ladysmith School District, who's hosting this speaker series, in that I did kindergarten at McGurr Elementary School in Nanaimo. My kindergarten teacher was named Mrs. Palat, and that was my first time stepping out of my home and into a system of new connections. And I loved kindergarten. And it started me off on a path of learning. And I think many of us who are joining today's session are involved in education in different capacities. This might be formally through primary or secondary or post-secondary institutions, but also in our homes, in our workplaces, and in our communities. And so I'm grateful to be with you all in this spirit of learning. I'd like to introduce myself in Anishinaabe Muin. So Bojo Nindinue Ma Goni Dog, Nigikin Dodem, Keegitah Indigo Anishinaabe Mong, Lindsay Nindijnaka Jaganashi Mong, Neashiwa Nigaming Nindonjaba. Bangia Tagonanata Anishinaabe, Nideshko Jutonji Anishinaabe Moyan. So in my introduction, I acknowledged that we're all relations. And this is a very common way to begin when speaking Anishinaabe Muin. And we have many stories about how we have more in common than we have differences. And this goes not just for us as humans, but with the world around us as well. We have a clan system where we have different relations to various animals that are found across our territories. So my clan or totem is the otter, nuuc. And you can see an image of a little otter behind Ted here. And so I have particular obligations that flow through that connection to Otter. And one of those connections is Otter is known as being a medicine being for us. And so there's different teachings around healing that I've been trying to learn. And also in my introduction, I introduced my Anishinaabe name, which is Keegitah, and my English name. And then I come from Anishinaabe. I'm a member of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, which is about 3.5 hours drive north of Toronto on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula. And this is where my family lives. And I'm very, as many of us have experienced this year, it's been a hard year not being able to connect with the places and people that we love and have that mobility and freedom to visit. So I'm grateful for opportunities like this to share stories of home and reconnect myself through being in the presence of people spread across many other places. So I would like to begin with 2 stories that explain how I came to research and practice and become an advocate of Indigenous languages and laws. And my first love was language. I remember being a little girl and sitting with my father, John Keegitah Borrows, and he was taking an Anishinaabe Moin, so Anishinaabe language class. Growing up, he did not learn the language. His grandfather was a fluent speaker, and he taught many of the children of my grandma's generation who returned from residential school how to re-speak their language. So he's someone who I really admire as standing up in the face of resistance and saying, no, this is important, and creating a loving environment to pass on those teachings through the language. So my father found all sorts of different ways he could to connect to language as we moved every 2 years growing up, hence why I did kindergarten in Nanaimo. Through his work as a law professor, there was great need to, he was doing Indigenous law, and at that time, not many people were doing it. And so we found ourselves in different parts of the globe and learning from those spaces and bringing ourselves as Anishinaabe and with ancestral roots throughout England as well, and seeing through how do all these different ways of being inform how we can be good in the world. And in fact, the name Anishinaabe, if you want to say Nishin, that means good, and Nabe means a person. So Anishinaabe is literally a good person. And it's not meant to be a prideful comment that we're all the best people out there, but rather what we're striving to become. And in sharing our names with ourselves and with others, it's a reminder of what is our purpose in this world. And it's, as was shared in the introduction from Ted and through the song from Lawrence, it's to be good people and to share those moments with one another that can uplift and help us work through the challenges that we're facing. So when I went into my undergrad, I was inspired by this upbringing of these moments of learning Anishinaabe Muin, but without ever being in a full immersion setting. And I decided to study linguistics and Indigenous studies and really committed myself to learning as much as I could about Anishinaabe Muin. And I found myself in a small community in northern Minnesota. So Anishinaabe territories are primarily around the Great Lakes region. and can extend as far west as kind of North Dakota, Manitoba, and then east into Quebec, and then probably Michigan on the US side. And I was taking a language class at Bemidji State University, which is a public post-secondary institution there. And we were learning the word for blueberry pie. And I learned that this word from northern Minnesota, the Leech Lake dialect, is Chigayate we mitagoje minabashke minasagana bitusijkanish ikwabikinigane. And in learning this word for blueberry pie early on, it really sparked my interest and taught so much. I think you could write a whole book. I would love to write a children's book one day about this word, because it means old time Frenchmen exploding blueberries, blueberry sauce layered between thing, bend over and put it in the oven bread. So Anishinaabe is highly verb oriented. So in English, we often think of blueberry pie as a noun. It's a thing. But the way it's just been described in Anishinaabe is it was a process. It was an action that is embodied within this blueberry pie. And you can even go into each of those individual words and learn even more. So the first part, the Wemitigojev is our word for French person, and mitig is our word for stick, and way is what you say when something is making a waving action. So a French person is literally a stick waver, because when they arrived in our territories, they primarily came as missionaries initially. And they had their crosses, which were made out of wood, out of sticks, and they were waving them. And so this name became attributed to that moment in history. So we can see our language connects us temporally or in a time type way to what has happened in our world. I loved the word in it, exploding blueberries. So our word for blueberries, mine, and then the exploding blueberries is minabashke. And I sort of think of bashke as being quite onomatopoeic. So it sounds a bit like an explosion. And many of our names for animals are connected to the sounds that those animals make. So the word for owl is kuku. The word for chicken, which was introduced, but still the name that we gave to it was bakakwe, connected to that bakakak kind of sound. Our word, one of our words I love, porcupine, is gog. And my grandma tells stories of being a little girl and collecting porcupine quills for her aunties. And you had to be quite skillful as a young person to know how to avoid being pricked by the quills as you were gathering them. And so I could just picture this name coming from, touching the quill and going, gag, from the porcupine. So there are stories of kind of the embodied ways that you listen to the animals or you interact with the animals that is then reflected within the language. So there's just so much to learn from the way that individual words are said, how words are put together. And we have a type of grammar marker, like if you've learned French or Spanish, you learn about how you need to learn the gender of the word. So le or la or el or le in Spanish. And in Anishinaabe, we have something called grammatical animacy. So many of our words are marked based on whether or not in our worldview that particular being is living or not living. So something like a tree or a rock or the different animals, those are most often marked grammatically as living. But something like maybe that's been transformed quite a bit, like a chair, even though it comes from a living tree, in that transformed state, it's not marked as living anymore. So I think there's a lot to explore in that type of concept, and you can see you could become a language philosopher, looking into the different words and how people speak. And you can imagine if our word for blueberry pie, if that's similar to other of our words, when you go into a governance meeting, you're not going in with having a sense of, we've got 1 hour, we need to efficiently make this decision. You're going in with a sense of, we need to be painting pictures in one another's minds of what it is we're speaking about, and inviting one another into a storied sense of the world. And that takes time. And I think that the importance of slowing down and listening and giving space for the types of conversations that are important is so key. And our languages can help us carve out that space if we let them. I think that it's a great lie of capitalism that everything needs to be done quickly and there always needs to be more and more. And I think through my experiences with Anishinaabe as well as other Indigenous languages, there's been teachings embedded in there that show the importance of being playful, of making mistakes, of slowing down. And those are lessons that are often hidden or devalued based on the current values that are existing in our business-oriented world today. So that's kind of some of what helped me get a passion for language. And as I was learning Anishinaabe and studying linguistics in my undergrad, I traveled to these different places in the world and just really showed up to listen and observe, and felt really uplifted by what I was seeing in these places, which eventually led to my book. And then as I was in this process of editing my book, I got into law. And who knows, I guess sometimes our parents influence us for better or worse. And through my father's experiences, I ended up in law. But also I think when you're part of a smaller community that you feel really connected to, you end up bringing upon yourselves the sorrows and challenges of that community as well. And in 1993, my great uncle Howard Jones was chief of our Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, and he and Francis Najwin ended up going to court because we were experiencing an inability to practice our fishing and hunting rights as set out under treaty. And just recently, we've been seeing this play out in the Maritimes as well, with the fishing over there and the Mi'kmaq exercising their treaty rights and then getting into lots of conflict with commercial fishermen. This is something that is not new, but it was really hit a height in 1993. And I was just a young person, very young person at that time. But I remember sitting around and hearing these stories of people talking about lawyers and judges and courts and arguments. And I think that planted something in me. And as I chose to go into law, I was gifted with a learning experience with the Indigenous Law Research Unit at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. And I'd love to tell you a little bit about this research unit because they're doing some incredible work that you may be interested in following up on. But it was founded in 2012. In fact, because of the not all because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but that played a role in it. The TRC was looking for understandings of how did Indigenous peoples in our own legal traditions deal with harms that were occurring within our communities and then between our communities? And because this is very much what residential school was, it was harms occurring between our communities and subsequently within our communities. And so, what are the Indigenous legal resources that could respond to this challenge? And so, we went out and through interest from a number of different First Nations, we partnered with them and engaged in this kind of legal research of asking elders and youth and medicine people and women, and trying to understand, how does your legal tradition deal with harm? So I spent some time on Cape Breton Island at Eskasoni, which is a Mi'kmaq community. And I was so fascinated to learn that for them, a decision maker should never be an impartial third party, like we have in the Canadian system with a judge, who the moment they have any connection to the person before them, they have to excuse themselves from hearing that case because they'll be impartial or biased. Whereas in Mi'kmaq law, you want to have someone who has a very deep connection and deep understanding of whoever it is that has caused some sort of harm, because they'll know best what it is that that person needs as a sentence, or as what they're going to need in order to get through that harm that they occurred and restore balance back to the community. And you can see why this wouldn't always work in like a big urban setting like Toronto, very multiculturally with people from all over. But in the Mi'kmaq legal world, that very much makes sense, and has for many, many years been the way that community has taken care of one another. And I also was able to do some of this research in my own community. And I loved spending my days with relatives, going from house to house, having tea and biscuits and talking about law. And you can imagine, if someone showed up in your house and said, "So tell me about your people's laws," you'd probably be like, I don't really know what to say. So we came in with questions about specific stories. So for us, we have Nanabojo or trickster stories, also known as Nanabush. And we went in, my colleague Hannah Askew and I, and we would read a story together, or we would tell a story. And then we'd say, like, what does that story make you think about in terms of like, did they respond to that challenge in a way that you think was good? What do you think was missing? What do you think the main issue was in this story? And who was the decision maker in it? And what were the reasons behind why they acted the way we did? So through this kind of lens, we got to pull out this incredible view of one lens of Anishinaabe law. And in that particular summer of 2012, when the Indigenous Law Research Unit was founded and we were doing this work, we were on a boil water advisory in my community. And as many of you know, this is very common across Canada in our community, in our Indigenous communities especially. And this one summer when this was happening, our band council, which is under the Indian Act. The Indian Act was established in the late 19th century as kind of our primary piece of legislation that deals with Indians, so First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And they it basically is a super colonial law. And it is still the primary piece of legislation in effect today. And it's really incredible that this is still operating. And so our band council passed a bylaw to look after the water. And essentially it said, we need to have people trained in our community who are technicians, who will be able to operate our water management system. We need to have X amount of funding set aside so we can ensure that we can afford the bills that are connected to this water treatment plant. It was very technical kind of bylaw. And Hannah and I went to talk to the late Carleen Nipate Elliott at the Senior Center on Reserve. And when we told her this story, we thought she'd be really excited that the band office passed a bylaw. And instead, she was just devastated. And her response to us was, "Laws are for the lawless." And she went on to explain that the moment you have to write a law down, it means that it's not living inside of you anymore. It's not written on your heart. It's not something that's carrying with you on the day to day. And for her growing up, she learned Anishinaabe laws, her family's laws, through ceremony. She learned them through being in relationship with the water and singing water songs. So we have a number of water songs that women in particular have a responsibility to care for and pass on and sing to the water. And she grew up doing this. She learned stories growing up about the different beings who lived in the water and how she was related to those different beings. And it was through this kind of worldview of ceremony, of song, of story, of language, that she learned how to take care of the water. And of course, now on the Soggy and Bruce Peninsula, where our reserve is located, it's become more urban, and we have neighboring towns, and there's industrial activities, and there's a Bruce nuclear power plant that is on our traditional territories. And these types of activities impact the water in a way that perhaps initially we weren't dealing with that kind of impact. And so we're really interested in learning, well, what are the ceremonies and songs and stories of our past, and how do we build bridges such that they can apply today, even though our world seems so different in many ways. And I really admire a group of women who are water walkers, and they go from lake to lake across the region. And really, they've done it across Turtle Island, but frequently they go across the region and they sing to the water, and they talk to people along the way. And I think it just brings awareness to that sacred connection that we have with our waters. And the more we're in relationship with our lands, of course, the better we're going to know how to take care of them. And Indigenous law has these rich processes and structures that contribute to teaching us how it is that we can be actively living those relationships and having them written on our hearts, so that we don't have to write a 500-page water law code that nobody's likely ever going to read. And I've worked as a lawyer now for 4 years, and I've worked with a lot of Indigenous communities. And one of my favorite stories is when I was working with my friend and colleague Helen Copeland of the St'át'imc Nation. And they were engaged in the work of creating a constitution. And lots of nations across the country are engaged in this work of articulating their constitutions and finding ways to write them down such that outsiders can understand. And at one point in this process, Helen just thought, no one's ever going to read this constitution. We need to do something else. And so she got their hand drummers together. And one of those hand drummers was able to receive the song that would be their constitution song. And so it can be sung at the beginning of meetings. It's something that people can remember. And it does that work of living inside of you. And what I like about this is that I think sometimes it is important to write things down and have those tax codes or those complex structures that are going to speak to industry and to government and to those who are not internal to the community. But then I also think we can't lose sight of the importance of seeing it all as a tapestry, and that's just one thread, one strand of what makes up the Constitution. But it needs to be interdisciplinary. You know, looking after the land is one of those threads. Um, Language speakers are one of those threads to our Constitution. The Constitution song is one of those threads. And so with all of those different people and talents and gifts acting in tandem with one another, then I think we can be stronger and present to the world in a way that is more rich. So I really appreciated her story in that case. And this laws are for the lawless is really what I entered law school thinking. Showing up for my first day at the University of Toronto and just kind of sitting back and thinking, here I am 3 years now. I'm going to be spending lots of money learning about laws. And here Carlene has just told me that laws are only needed for the lawless. So I love those different kinds of trickster stories that can guide us and remind us of the importance of viewing our world in this nuanced way. And it's not always the dominant story that is necessarily the true one. So after having these experiences of learning language and being introduced to law, I kept plugging away at this book, Otter's Journey Through Indigenous Language and Law. And just because of my love for story, and I think that friendship is one of the best paths to reconciliation. And my experience with a good book is it feels like a friend. And so it felt like writing was just one, again, the tapestry, one strand that could invite us into a collective experience with these stories and some of the teachings that are contained in them. And I think a number of people here today are, again, educators in your various capacities. And so I wanted to just spend a few minutes to walk through kind of the main findings that I had through this multi-year learning experience and then peer review process as well of what it means to write an academic book for an academic press. And so the book begins in my community of Anishinaabe. And in this chapter, Otter is the protagonist. She's the main character who you travel with throughout the whole book. And so she's just learning from this family on the reserve. She's kind of in the water, listening into this home of what this intergenerational family is sharing with one another. And from this, we learn a bit about the background to Indigenous languages and laws. And, you know, there's approximately 70 Indigenous languages in Canada, in about 10 language families. And that can roughly correspond to the number of Indigenous legal traditions that we have in Canada as well. So that's an incredible diversity moving from coast to coast up into the Arctic of worldviews and of people to learn from and of things to learn about. So Otter's really grappling with that, but then seeing how despite that diversity, the Canadian government in those early days placed these blanket laws across the whole of the country and required that Indigenous children would go to residential schools. And part of the knowledge in doing that was that it would take away from some of this diversity and try and bring people into what maybe in a positive sense they thought of as being more unified, but also had such devastating consequences as children returned home and had this sense of disconnection from their family. And so through this first chapter, I'm really telling stories from my own family because there is so much diversity and I can't speak to all of it. But in my community, a lot of my family members went to the Spanish residential school on the north shore of Lake Huron. And that was a place that was quite storied and fabled in my upbringing, and hearing elders who had attended that talk about it. But then also, they made incredible friendships and connections to other communities through being there together. And I love that my great, great, great grandfather, who was Peter Giganos Jones, he spoke Anishinaabe as his primary language, but then he also spoke Mohawk because of trading relations with Haudenosaunee. And he spoke some English and some French as well. And so we have this long history of engaging with our neighbors. And I believe that we had processes in place that could help us to connect to our neighbors in really good ways. And so Otter is kind of just thinking through all this, and how do our laws and how do our languages, even though there is this really hard history of colonization, how are we resisting through it all? And how can we see today the gifts of that resistance, and what we've moved forward with in this world today? So from there, she receives a call to kind of dive down into the lake and surface up in her next space of inquiry, of curiosity. And she goes to Nunavut. And I chose this as a chapter because when I was 14 years old, I moved to Nunavut for a year with my father. My mom and my sister didn't come. My mom hates the cold, so that wasn't going to be a good move for her. So my dad and I went up there together, and he was teaching at the Kitsurak Law School, and it was their first time ever having this law school. Before the Kitsurak program, Inuit students and Nunavut people generally, they would have to go all the way south to, say, Ottawa to become trained in law, to go back home and work in leadership capacities in their homes. And so a Kitsurak was a response to say that's not ideal. We need to be setting up opportunities to share with the Inuit students and Nunavut students about Canadian law, so that they can stay home and learn what this is and apply it. But also, it needs to be a space of Inuit law, and a space where elders can be teachers, not just Canadian law trained scholars. And it needs to be a place where students, when they need to go and hunt and gather that food for their families, that they can take off and miss class and come back, and it's not going to be devastating for them. It needs to be a place where they can communicate and work through issues in their language. And I remember sitting in the back of the classroom, and there would be days where they would only speak in Inuktitut with one another, and there was a few only English speakers, and they just sit back and let the students do this type of work. And so I think, how can we do that in other law schools and create these spaces where you can show up and have it be, the terms of discussion are so different when you're able to speak in your language and speak about your laws. And I've heard different scholars and thinkers argue that you can't decolonize a colonial institution because they're not meant to be. They're so ingrained in how they are. And I'm interested in that thought. And I think that there's a lot of truth to it. But I also think this is what our world is kind of operating with right now. And so we can't just let perfections, like the ideal, let's say the ideal would be to completely abolish the institution and set up something totally new. I don't think we should let the ideal stop us from finding those ways of transforming within what does exist. And again, the tapestry, like we need the different threads. And I think that a Kitsurak program is one thread of a model that shows a way that is more positive than not having it exist, to have students learn and engage in a way that is more connected to their own legal traditions and cultures. And so Otter is learning about this school, and she also goes to the high school. And this was a big deal for me, 14 years old, mostly you just care about your friends, showing up to a completely new school. And I was so excited because they had an Inuktitut language class. And so I went to it and was really surprised to learn that there were very few people in the class, and everyone that was in the class, basically, except for I remember one other person, they already spoke Inuktitut because that was their language at home. So there wasn't a lot of new learners. And Iqaluit, being the capital of Nunavut, sees a lot of Southerners come up. Like, I came up for a similar reason. My family had a particular expertise that they could offer, and so we end up in this as uninvited guests in this place. And I thought learning the language would be such a way to embed myself in those stories and hopefully create good relationships. And then it became very apparent that nobody else really saw it that way, and that it was just the Inuit students who already had that proficiency who were doing it. So for my research for the book, I was interested in the statistics behind Inuktitut language programming in Nunavut. And there's so much that's great, and then there's so many challenges too. And it's really hard for a fluent speaker of a language to go to a high school classroom when you have no kind of training in how to work behaviorally with students. And that can be a real impediment. So in exploring these kind of ideas, I think about what does this mean for maybe you today, and thinking through in your role, if let's say you're at an educational institution, what are the small ways that you can incorporate Indigenous language and law into your programming? And I like to think that there's 3 levels of engagement. There's the publicly available. So this is where you can go to a book, you can go to a video, you can go to a newspaper article, and you can learn how to count to 10 in Hulkaminam. So when you're teaching your PE class and it's time to do your 10-second stretches, you can count to 10 in Hulkaminam with the students. Something small like that, but those types of small things over time, I think, can really add up. So Otter has this experience in Nunavut. I did want to tell you the other 2 levels. So there's the publicly available, and then there's the some relationship. So if you have resources in your workplaces or in your communities, where you can have members of the local community come and do collaborative work. So it's not just always asking someone else to, can you come and do the land acknowledgement, but really being like, what do you think would be useful? And how can we like collectively build this sense of teaching and rooting students and people into these places where we're living? And then the third most deep level of engagement is immersion. And not everyone is going to have capacity to immerse themselves in an Indigenous language or legal tradition or community. And I think, again, moving away from perfection, we just need to see that as okay. And in fact, those first 2 levels of engagement, if that's where some people get to, that's way more than currently exists. So I think in seeing those different pathways, it can really make us think, what can I do today? What can I do this year? What can I do in the next 10 years? And having this kind of layered approach to reconciliation and bringing these teachings into our lives. So in some of the other chapters, Otter goes to New Zealand and is able to learn about the immersion programs that exist with Māori language and Māori law. And of course, it's very different in New Zealand because it's just the Māori. And although there's different dialects, they're all mutually intelligible. So in Canada, again, our diversity just creates such a different landscape in how it is that we can go about this work of revitalizing language, Indigenous language and law. And then she goes to New Hampshire and learns at a private post-secondary institution. Why is it that these universities aren't teaching Indigenous languages? They teach Russian, they teach Mandarin, they teach Italian, but Indigenous languages are so infrequently on the curriculum. And so Otter's really exploring the reasons behind that and how to challenge those reasons and create more of those programs within these colonial institutions. And then there's a chapter set in Coast Salish territories around the Salish Sea. And I really think that there are incredible resources that we can have in a public way. So I worked right out of high school as a coastal naturalist on BC ferries. If anyone has taken kind of the Swartz Bay to Tsiwasson, Vancouver, Victoria ferry, you're on that boat for an hour and a half, passing through Indigenous lands, through, Hulkaminam speaking places, Tsilhqot'in speaking places. You can see Mount Baker down, again, Coast Salish territory. And those mountains, those islands, they are ancestors. They have names, they have stories. And you're so often passing through and you just don't know, and you don't know how to know. And so I felt that was an opportunity to really share. And then I got in so much trouble by my boss because we didn't have the permission to share. And this is again where I feel that those 3 levels are so important. There is tons of publicly available information out there. And if a Coast Salish person has written something, if you're attributing it to them, I feel like that means they want that knowledge shared. And I think for a lot of our Indigenous peoples across Canada, we're doing this hard work of writing and of speaking and of making videos and of putting this information out there. And so we can't say, oh, I don't have permission to share that. It's like, no, they put it out, amplify those voices. Like that's what that's there for. And I know it's important to think about relationships. And yes, we need to do that work for sure. But again, there are things we can do without having that next level of engagement. So Otter learns all this, and I only have, I think, like a minute left here. So I want to share 2 things finally in this this onslaught of information. But I really hold my hand up to the University of Victoria Faculty of Law, which is now in year 3 of their joint Indigenous law common law degree, where the future legal practitioners, lawyers, judges, moms, dads, teachers, whatever it is they end up becoming, are going to have an introduction to Indigenous law and can see that as real and authoritative. And we know that so much is happening across the country now, from pipelines to dams to COVID-19, all these challenges that could really benefit from Indigenous legal traditions. And so this is a site of action and of knowledge and learning. And so in conclusion, I would just like to draw out 2 small themes. One is that small acts done consistently can really add up over time. And I think that we need to be really gentle on ourselves in today's world. We're doing a lot during this pandemic. We're being full-time parents at home and full-time workers. That is not easy. And so remember that those small things, they don't need to overwhelm you, but what is it in your work that you're currently doing? And what are the small ways to begin with that you can incorporate Indigenous language, justice, or law into your lives? And I want to say miigwech bizindawiyeg. Thank you all so much for listening. And I hope that somehow we can carry these conversations more personally into the future. Miigwech.
Lindsay, thank you so much for that. I know that you have a lot more to share too, and that's such a beautiful story that you've gifted us with the otter traveling around, looking at all the challenges, but also all the amazing learning that's embedded in languages and laws and story. We have a phrase here in our Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools that we take small steps often. And you've reminded us too that those small steps are going to lead somewhere. And if we are thoughtful about them, then we too can walk as a good person on this earth and in this school district. I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. And again, following that tradition and the protocols of this territory, I'll ask Tsiongkhwat if he has any final words and to close the house for us today.
Lindsay Quayausta Naktan Squalawan Sata Ali Nishwalakwa HKCM. Really want to thank you, Lindsay, for sharing everything that you shared with us today. A lot of good reminders about how we are to be and the way that we think. It's very similar to Coast Salish ways of thinking and being, and for uplifting all of our attendees and us as panelists, reinforcing a lot of ideas and thoughts that we try to walk with each and every day when we wake up. Because when I wake up as an educator, a person, I just want to get up and share everything that I can to make everybody feel good about who they are and what they believe in, and honoring and acknowledging the diversity that we do have in Canada. So I'll share a little bit of a song. It's called "We Are One." Whoa, whoa, ooh, ooh, oh, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, ooh, ooh, whoa, whoa, Nishwalakwa, East School District 68, HK.
Yeah, we're done. Thanks, everybody.